A lot is said in the media about failed ERP implementations and digital transformations, but we don't often talk about the ones that succeed and why they succeed. That's exactly what I want to cover here today. My name is Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their ERP implementations and their digital transformation journeys. It's been noted in many studies that somewhere between 70 and 80% or more of digital transformations fail. A lot has been written about failed ERP implementations. I've even published a lot of YouTube videos and case studies around failed implementations and the lessons learned. But oftentimes we get the question, well, what about the successful ones? What are they doing differently? And the good news is there's a lot of clear patterns that successful companies do differently than their failed counterparts. So what I want to do today is unpack a case study of Third Stage's, and this is an ERP implementation that we've helped them with over the last few years. It's a very large organization, big multinational organization. They're a $25 billion steel company with around 25,000 employees, and they recently went through a big, massive ERP implementation and digital transformation. Despite their size and complexity and the overall risk of these sorts of projects, this company was extremely successful in their implementation. And it wasn't just because they hired Third Stage Consulting to help them with the project. They made some key fundamental decisions and leadership actions that helped them on the path towards success, and that's what I want to cover here today. Now, before we jump into this case study, I want to encourage you to download our ebook called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations, because a lot of the lessons we'll discuss here today from this case study influenced this particular paper. And there's a lot of details in the paper that you won't hear in this video. So I encourage you as a supplementary point of reference to download that book. You can read it for free by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. Now, this particular case study involves a large steel company based in North America. They generate about $20 billion of revenue, and they have about 25,000 employees. And this company is very interesting because they're a highly disruptive company that completely transformed the US and North American steel industry. They really came into prominence in a time in the late 70s and into the 1980s where Japanese steel companies were dominating the US market. And what this company did is they invented the concept of a different type of steel production that completely undermined and undercut the competition. And they were able to outperform other steel competitors, and they're able to produce better products at a lower price because of this disruptive model. And the reason I share this background information with you is not only so you understand the type of company we're talking about here today and some of the manufacturing complexities and the raw material complexities that go along with it, but also because this is a large, complex organization that has disrupted an industry, an entire industry. And that's an important backdrop because that highly influenced how they managed their digital transformation an ERP project, which is what I'll continue to discuss here in this video. This company is a very well-known company, although a lot of consumers don't know about it because they produce raw steel that's used by other manufacturers and companies that build buildings and infrastructure and things of that nature. But people in the business world know this company really well. In fact, if you've ever read or heard of the book called Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, this case study is prominently featured in that book. Now, in the book, they don't talk about the digital transformation. They talk about the business model and the way they disrupted their business and how they innovated an entire industry and transformed an entire industry. So this backdrop is very important because this influences how they managed their ERP implementation and were able to be successful. Now, the first thing that this company did that's very different from their counterparts that are more commonly failing in their digital transformations is that they had a very strong business and operations focus, particularly as it relates to this particular project. Now, you may be saying to yourself, of course they had a business and operations focus. Every organization does. But this company is different. They have a very strong focus on the things that matter to their customers and the things that matter to their employees. If something is proposed that doesn't add value to one of those two parties, the customers or the employees, they don't do it. They don't get caught up in trends or buzzwords or what the competition is doing. They forge their own path based on the way they view the market and the way their customers view this particular company. Now, this is a really important point because when it comes to the digital transformation and ERP implementation, they treated that project the exact same way. They didn't even care about the technology per se. In fact, they had somewhat of an allergic reaction to technology. The people running the project were self-proclaimed anti-technologists and people that don't really understand technology, and they were some of the best leaders that I've ever worked with within a client. And the reason for that is, again, they're coming at things from a business solution perspective. If the technology that's proposed didn't fit their needs, they didn't buy it. If the software vendor or system integrator was proposing a solution or an approach that didn't make sense for the business, they didn't do it. And it was pretty cut and dry, and it's pretty simple for them. They're able to cut through a lot of the noise and a lot of the garbage that goes into these projects and a lot of the things that ultimately make these projects more complex than they need to be. This company was able to take a very complex ERP implementation and simplify it in a way that fit their business and focused only on the things that provided value to the organization and to the customers and the employees of the organization. Just as the organization and the team had a business and operations focus, this client also focused on business value. They wouldn't do things that didn't add value and ROI to the project. Just to give you some additional context, this company was using multiple ERP systems, and they were moving to consolidate as many of those systems onto one platform as they could, but also recognizing that they weren't going to necessarily move to one single platform across the entire organization. And the reason for that is because it didn't add business value. They couldn't identify the business value of having only one single system that might be a bit inflexible or not meet the needs of the entire organization, but they recognized that there was some value in consolidating some of the systems. So they were really good at identifying where that point of diminishing returns was, to where they didn't necessarily overinvest in technology or get sucked into a marketing hype sales cycle about how one single system could solve all of their problems. They didn't fall for any of that stuff. In fact, they didn't really care what the vendors had to tell them. They didn't care what the system integrator had to tell them. And at times, they didn't care what we had to tell them. And I shouldn't say they didn't care. They would take it into advisement, but they would make their own decision independent of what we thought or what other parties thought. And that's a very admirable trait that made them successful in this project. Just to give you a specific example of how they did this, the software vendor that was implementing their solution was actually implementing the legacy on-premise solution of their ERP system. During the rollout, which was about a 7-year project, the software vendor that was implementing the solution had really refocused their organization on their new cloud offering, which many software vendors have done over the years. So that part's not a surprise. But what was different here is that the vendor was trying to convince this client to stop implementing on-prem solutions and move over to the cloud solution that had just been released not too long before this point. And the organization, with our help, assessed the cloud version of that technology. And they ultimately determined that despite the fact that the vendor really wanted them to move to the cloud and they really thought that there'd be business value there, the client looked at it and said, it doesn't deliver business value. In fact, it delivers negative business value. Not only are we going to pay more for the cloud solution, but the cloud solution didn't have the same maturity, especially in some of the complex manufacturing areas that they needed capabilities in. So they politely declined and said, we're sticking to on-prem. And when the software vendor said, yeah, but everyone's moving to the cloud, yeah, but on-prem is dying, they didn't care. They didn't fall for it. They didn't take the bait. And I think that was the right decision. It made sense for this organization to implement the solution the way they did. They didn't fall into the pressure of sales hype from the software vendors. So this is a good reminder that you shouldn't make any sort of decision without first considering the business value. If the business value is there, you should probably do it. And if it's not, then you probably shouldn't. Over the years, I've worked with over 1,000 different organizations, helping them through various types of digital transformations. And I can say that hands down, this company had the most unique and probably the strongest culture of any organization I've worked with. And the reason I bring this up is because their culture was so aligned. You would meet any person from this team and they were very much on the same page. Their personalities just gelled really well together. They didn't tolerate lack of performance. They didn't tolerate dead weight. They didn't tolerate people making decisions out of self-interest that didn't benefit the company. And this is something else that was written about in Innovator's Dilemma, is their culture. And what's really interesting, even more interesting about this company, is they hated the word culture. I remember early on, I made an observation about how unique and powerful their culture was, and they didn't like that. They told me, don't mention the word culture around here. And that's my point right there. They had a very strong culture that puked all over the idea of talking about culture. To them, culture was just part of their DNA. It's just who they were, and we didn't need to talk about it, and that's fair enough. The other thing they were very good at as it relates to culture is change management. They're really good at leading change. And guess what? They also didn't like the term change management. They really didn't like it, and we had to find a different word to use. We also had to take somewhat of a Trojan horse approach to helping them through that change management because they didn't want to call it that. So that's the irony of it all, is as good as they were at culture and managing change, they didn't like the terms to describe it, but the point is they were good at it. It was baked into their DNA. And when it came time to train people and move people through the process, it was second nature to them. They knew how to do that because they'd been through so much change. They'd grown through acquisitions over the years, and those were some of the reasons why the culture and the change management components of this leadership team and this organization was so powerful. So one lesson and takeaway we can learn from this is that culture and organizational change, even if you don't want to call it that, is something that's absolutely critical to being successful in a digital transformation. Another strong success factor that this organization did that's a lot different from companies that fail in their digital transformations is that they had extreme ownership of the project. They were clearly in charge of the project. Yes, they brought in third stage consulting to help them and advise them. They brought in the software vendor. They brought in the technical system integrators. They would take all that input and leverage the strengths of those different third parties, but at the end of the day, they made the decisions. We at Third Stage did not make a single decision for them. We made recommendations, but we would never make a decision for them because they wouldn't let us and they didn't want us to. Same goes for the software vendor and the system integrator. Now, again, when I say this out loud, it sounds like common sense, but it's amazing how many organizations just defer responsibility to the software vendor or the system integrator or the outside consultants. A specific example I can give you here that ties into the example before about their resisting the temptation to move to cloud solutions prematurely. Another example is that they were noticing that the project was taking longer than expected. They noticed that decisions were taking a little longer than they thought. They were falling behind on the plan. And most organizations would probably recognize that, but they would probably just let it ride. They'd probably just keep rolling through the project, business as usual, hoping to get things back on track, hoping to correct or make up time later, and that just never happens. This company recognized that that probably wasn't going to happen with them either, so what they did is they said, guess what, we're moving slower than we assumed when we planned this project, so we're going to just embrace the fact that things are going a little slower and taking a little longer than we thought, and guess what, system integrator, we need you to cut back your staffing. Because that's where projects get into trouble, is they keep this high staffing level, assuming a shorter time frame, and then when that short time frame stretches out, maybe sometimes it doubles or triples, you've got that same staffing level that you didn't need, but you're still getting billed by the hour by those consultants. So they said, look, we know we need to stretch this out. We know you're staffing it for a shorter time frame. We need you to bring that staffing level down. And the system integrator wasn't happy about it. They fought tooth and nail to keep the resources on the project because it was in their self-interest to do so. But the client persisted, and they knew, and they had the confidence to know that that was the right answer. They didn't waver, and they went ahead and convinced the system integrator to do that, and the system integrator accommodated. So this is just one of many examples where this particular client was clearly in charge of the project. They weren't steamrolled by the software vendor or the system integrators. They managed those third parties, and they made the decisions they had to make to act in their self-interest and to do what's right for their business and for their team, regardless of what the software vendor or the system integrators might have wanted them to do instead. So how does this apply to you? What are the lessons that we can all take away here? Well, first of all, don't forget about culture and change management. Those are the things that are ultimately going to make or break a project. Make sure that your project is focused on business operations. If you lead with technology, you're more likely to fail because you're going to end up going down a bunch of rabbit holes that you don't need to, and you're going to end up spending a lot of time on money on technologies that don't make sense for your business. When you look at things from the perspective of business and operations and our strategic priorities, you're just going to make better decisions that are more aligned with your budget, with your strategic objectives, and all that good stuff. Also, focus on business value. If something's not delivering value or you can't justify it, you can't point to a tangible business case line item that justifies any sort of decision you're going to make, then you probably shouldn't do it. And then finally, and perhaps even most importantly, take ownership of your project. This is your project, just as you wouldn't outsource the building of your house without any sort of input or accountability or checkpoints along the way. You wouldn't do that, or you shouldn't do that for your ERP implementation. You need to own it. You can bring in the outside parties that you need or you think you need to help you, but at the end of the day, you have to make the decisions that are best for your business, and you're the only one that can really do that. So I hope this has provided you some guidance and lessons from a client that was extremely successful in their digital transformation. This is one of the more successful projects I've been involved with. It's one of the ones that I enjoyed the most, and I think it's the one that's the most telling about the way organizations should be running their ERP implementations. If more companies ran their projects like this one did, I guarantee we wouldn't have the high failure rates that we see in this industry. Now, if you'd like to learn even more lessons about how to make your project successful, I encourage you to read our ebook called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations. We've consolidated 20 different lessons and takeaways from having helped over 1,000 organizations through their digital transformations and ERP projects, and we've distilled that down to 20 things that you need to do to be successful in your project. You can read that book by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.